Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chaku Mathai. I'm the director for the STAR Center, and I'm a grateful member of this Recovery Live session this afternoon. This event is brought to you by the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. It's bringing recovery supports to scale, Technical Assistance Center strategy, otherwise known as Brass Tacks. So this TA Center, Brass Tacks, is dedicated to increasing access to recovery supports. And we achieve this kind of work by providing a number of mechanisms in technical assistance, supporting all of the things around systems transformation, and developing the capacity of peer-run, family-run, youth-run, recovery community organizations all around the country. Many of you have been participating in Brass Tacks for a while now, and we're very fortunate to have on this Recovery Live session some great speakers. And we'll be talking specifically about communicating the role and the value of peer support, which is, at this time, such an important topic. So I'm really excited to be able to do that with you. Now, what I'd like to do is introduce our speakers and then also be able to go into some of our housekeeping. So first, let me introduce our speakers. First, we have Donna Dimitrovic from the Foundation for Recovery. You want to wave hello, Donna, for now? Say hi. And we have Linda Lentini from Healing from Within at the Toivo Project and Advocacy Unlimited in Connecticut. And we have Hugh Davis from, Wisconsin Family Ties. Hugh, thank you for joining us. All right, so let's go over a few housekeeping items. First of all, I want you to know that Recovery Live events are really different from the other Brass Tacks webinar events. In particular, it's really about engaging you. And so getting, through the poll as well as through the chat. And I can see many of you are already introducing yourselves through the chat, so that's fantastic. What we really hope to do is give a chance to have an interactive dialogue around these important questions. And in this particular case, this topic of communicating the role and value of peer support. So what we want you to be able to do is, here, as you already are, typing into the chat box where it says comments and questions, there'll be a chance to really move through the room, ask some questions in that chat box, answer the polls. Some of you have already started doing that, and we'll look at probably 3 different polls today, and also have a Q&A session near the end. So what Donna, Linda, and Hugh will do is start the conversation about communicating the value with a few of their stories, and then we'll all get into it together. So let me say that I think that if you have any technical questions, I'm not the one to ask, but you can put it in the chat box. You can just give right in the comments and questions, just in the same spot there, ask your questions, say you need some help, and there's a great Brass Tacks tech support team that will be able to jump in and give you a hand. We also have, I wanted to point out, some great files for download. I'll be going over them a little bit later, but I want you to you'll see a files for download pod or area where all you have to do is click on the particular item. It'll be highlighted, and then you'll be able to download that file. There'll be a box that says download files, and you can just directly get that file onto your computer. They're great resources. I'm excited about them. They're very kind of quick information, reference, and graphic, one of those infographics, basically, that you'll be able to use. All right, I think that's it for now. If I realize I've forgotten something, I'll get back to you with it. But what I'd like to do is get right back into the conversation. So communicating the value and role of peer support has never been more important. This is something that, whether it's the integrity of what we're doing as peer supporters and having people understand us and really value us, I think that's a really big part of this. And at the same time, there's a conversation here that Donna and Linda and Hugh will be able to get into is what happens when we try to remain relevant in an environment and we try to do things that may make it harder to understand what peer support is. So we want to really understand what that means and how do we really define who we are and talk about who we are, explain it, create value propositions. Those are all very exciting things for me. So let me start with our first presenter, and that's Donna Dimitrovic. Donna, take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Chaku. My pleasure to be here today. And so what I wanted to talk with you first is about knowing your audience, and I can certainly tell you many of the lessons that I've learned since I started to work in recovery support services. So, for me, it is I kind of learned best by trial and error. And initially when I got involved into the work, I assumed everyone knew what a peer support specialist was or what peer coaches did. And actually learned that that is not true. I really had to be able to get my message around the audience that I had. So even though somebody may have a really strong clinical background or been in the field for a long time, they may not necessarily know what peer support is and they may think about it as AA or NA. And one example that I can share with you is I was a keynote speaker at a statewide conference, and it was a large conference, and it was mostly licensed professionals that were in the audience. And this was pretty early in my career here, and I didn't do a very good job of understanding who my audience was, and I got up there and started to talk about peer support in the addiction recovery field, and completely lost the audience. And you know, when you're like standing in front of a crowd of 200 people and everybody's looking at you with blank stares, you're like, okay, now what do I do, right? But it was a real lesson learned for me, because I knew at that point that before I went into doing a presentation around peer support, I had to know who I was talking to. You know, it's easy for me to go into a situation where I talk to folks and they're in the field and they understand the value, because people have the same passion as I do, and the passion around me, but it's kind of like speaking to the choir. So I think, you know, in my opinion, I believe that we really need to be out there in different audiences, not just in our own fields, but also other folks, to give them the perspective and the knowledge around what the value is of peer support. And I often try to also kind of meld in my story along with the presentation that I'm doing, just to talk about the positive side of what helped me when I got into recovery 37 years ago, what kind of support was there for me, and why I feel it's so important for people today to have those same supports, which includes peer support services. So, you know, I think that also provides an impact too, because it's a living example, and I think one of the presenters is going to talk about that a little bit more later on. But there are also organizations such as Faces and Voices that will have messaging training, maybe not just in line with what peer support is, but it actually talks about the language that we use, because I think that's also important. Knowing the language that we use makes sense to the audience that we have. You know, even if I'm talking to family members about peer support, I have to understand that they're not going to understand the language I talk every day because I'm in recovery. So it really needs to be focused on the message. At Foundation for Recovery, what we did this year was develop a marketing and communications plan so that we can have that as part of our strategy moving forward for the next couple of years, so that we're able to really focus on what peer support services are, what it means, and what the value of a peer support person brings to the table, and how we complement those on the professional side. So thank you.
Wow. Yeah, that's going to be exciting. Thank you, Donna. So, I mean, you raised a lot of important points around, you know, the challenges that happen when you start to know your audience. That actually cues up a question around, well, is the language I use actually going to connect with that audience? And so that might be a change. And the fact that you're now thinking about a marketing plan, that's fantastic. We're going to probably follow up with that a little bit later. So speaking of identities, one of the things that's important is for us to know a little bit more about who's in the room. And so you have a poll going on right now. This is great. We have a very diverse audience that's listening in and involved people in recovery, like myself, by the way. I identify as a person in mental health and addiction recovery. And I think part of what we see here is the intersectionality of our human experience really showing up, because there's so many things that we're bringing to the table. And here in peer support, we're emphasizing some aspects of our lived experience that are really important to have some shared similar life experiences around. So recovery coaches are in the room, peer support specialists are in the room, we have marketing and communication specialists in the room, case managers, clinicians, program supervisors, executive directors. This is fantastic. Educational staff, students, policymakers, researchers, and a whole list of others, which I can't wait to find out who you are. So, so I'm going to start looking in the chat box. If you are in that other category, try to give yourself a chance to be more explicit in the chat box and tell us a little bit more about it. So considering that conversation around knowing your audience, there's also this conversation about sticking with it and being persistent and persevering through some of the challenges. And Linda offered to talk about that. So Linda Lentini from Connecticut, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Shaku. My name is Linda Lentini. I'm from Connecticut. I'm Director of Healing from Within by Toivo by Advocacy Unlimited. That says a lot. So I've been with this agency for a number of years, and when I first started off, I started off in the peer support. I was training as director of the peer support program that we have in Connecticut. In that role, I had to be very persistent, talking about the importance of why people like myself, I also identify as a person in recovery from addiction and mental health. People like myself are very important to be part of the team, not only the conversation about how peers can work in the role, but also about the value of peer support. In my early recovery, having somebody that had been through similar experiences be able to talk to me and get through some similar situations was very powerful. And so as the director of Recovery University, which is our peer support program in Connecticut, I had a lot of tough conversations about how that person's going to fit into the clinical environment, how that person's going to be able to share their story, and how that person's going to be able to be part of the team. So step forward to the role I'm in right now. I'm Director of Healing from Within. What we do under that program is myself as a peer and many of us as part of the Toivo team go onto inpatient psychiatric units and into outpatient settings to provide mind-body practices, because a big part of my recovery now are those mind-body practices that help me with my recovery and make sure that I stay on the path that I'm on. So we go on to inpatient units and go into outpatient settings. In the beginning, when we first rolled out this program, it became evident that some people didn't necessarily want us simply because we had been there ourselves prior, and so there was some resistance. But to continue to have the conversations with hospital administrators, hospital agency staff about the importance of how we got through it ourselves and how we could share with other people that are currently going through similar situations is a very important tactic. So we continue to have conversations. We continue to address some of the concerns. And one of the best stories I have is somebody that was really reluctant to have us come onto their inpatient unit, really reluctant, and had set up all these barriers. So I continue to have conversations. I continue to demonstrate how these mind-body practices, how a lot of these techniques have helped myself and a lot of people, that eventually this person allowed us to come on. And one of the people receiving services truly appreciated it and continues using these practices in their own lives. So just being persistent no matter what and not giving up, and also demonstrating our value as ourselves, because a lot of us that work in these roles have had similar experiences that have brought us to the point that we've reached out for help from other people. So we bring a lot of value to this role. A lot of people that work in the peer role bring a lot of value, so never to not recognize that.
All right, Linda, thank you. So
Thank you.
One of the things that has always been a challenge for many of us is the use of data and describing what we do and telling stories that capture not only the important and the value and the outcome from a lived experience perspective, but really telling stories with data. And Hugh, thanks to you for coming to us with some information about that. So let me turn to you about that. Hugh?
Thanks. My name's Hugh Davis. I work for Wisconsin Family Ties. We're a family-run organization, and so we serve families that include kids with social, emotional, behavioral, mental health challenges. First I want to say that we're strong believers in the power of stories. We believe that stories are a strong weapon against stigma. Stories foster connection and rekindle hope. And we've used stories throughout our existence to demonstrate the impact. And we've had the opportunity to work with thousands of families over the last 30 years. And, we've been pretty successful at having some good outcomes. We've been successful at keeping kids at home and in school. We've reversed school suspensions and expulsions. We've reunited families that were separated by out-of-home placements. We've helped families navigate complex service systems and connect with needed services and providers. We found housing for homeless families. So we have lots of stories. We think that those should be sufficient. But what we found was, despite these, what we thought were fairly remarkable stories, we didn't see that transfer into support for or promotion of our organization. It did result in more referrals, however, which stretched our capacity and really kind of threatened the sustainability of the organization. So then, we persisted in telling those stories, but then a couple of things happened. In late 2013, there was federal legislation introduced called the Families in Mental Health Crisis Act. It was really, from our perspective, a misnomer, the title of it. It presented the medical model as the only model deserving of funding, and it painted peer-run organizations as being anti-treatment. And we knew this to be untrue. Around this same time, we started hearing more public statements or more people willing to publicly state that some of the challenges faced by the families that we served were due to some sort of personal failure. And I think that, most of us would have to admit, we've all heard it now with a lot of the polarized political rhetoric. We've heard lots of people say that a lot of the families wouldn't need Medicaid if they lived better lives. And so we feel that's a personal affront. Most of the families that we need or that we work with need some sort of additional help. And so we, a couple of years ago, started looking at what can we do to combat some of these narratives that seem to be gaining some traction out there. And so we joined with a consumer-run organization in our state and a recovery organization in our state, and also with the Medical College of Wisconsin to do some research. And the research was called Peer Support and Parent Peer Support, Impact and Relative Importance as Reported by Service Recipients. So we went out and we surveyed people who had received peer support, both adults and parents who had received parent peer support. And we asked them questions about that service that they received. There were 11 services that they could select on the survey, and out of those 11 service options, peer support was most frequently ranked number one in importance to those service recipients. The other thing that we really wanted to get at was this idea that peer-run organizations were anti-treatment. And so we wanted to find out, did the peer support worker refer people to other services? And if so, did the service recipient engage in those services? And what we found was the peer specialist connected 72% of respondents to other services. And for those who were referred to mental health services, the engagement rate was 96%, which is way better than anything that we could find in literature. So, I think even though all of us knew that peer support provided benefits that you can't get from any other source, this data has helped us be able to prove that. So we still use stories, but we use data behind the scenes to support those stories. Even more so, we have, as an organization, we hired a program evaluator for the first time ever about a little over a year ago, and we conducted a more comprehensive evaluation of our services in 2017, and so we're using the data from that again to show the effectiveness of the work that we do, and in fact we've incorporated these activities into our 5-year strategic plan, where we believe that part of our strategy has to be to build a case for peer support and to not only prove the efficacy of the work that we do as an organization, but also to contribute to the national research on peer support.
All right. Thank you, Hugh. That was excellent. So, and thanks, everyone. I think what we'll do at this point is close the first poll and bring up a second poll that asks about the organizations that you belong to. And again, this may not capture all of your organizations. Just take a look at it and see if you can identify where you're coming from today. So, and while you're doing that, what we'll do is put up a few of, at least one example of one of the info briefs as well, and I'll discuss that briefly. And then we'll come back to a Q&A period and discuss some of the information we're getting in the polls as well. So for right now, I can see already that we have treatment providers, community-based recovery organizations, we have peer-run organizations, RCOs, which are the recovery community organizations, hospitals, government agencies, education programs, and again, some others that if you want to identify in the chat. I appreciated those of you who are already identifying, and not letting yourself just remain an other and actually identify where you're from. Thank you for that, and do more of that again in the chat. So while the brief is coming up, let me tell you a little bit about it. So we know that many of you are actually working to educate a variety of different audiences, and that's part of the value of this webinar and this Recovery Live session. What we hope to do is support you with some resources. And so Brass Tacks has developed a series of presentations and informational briefs as technical assistance tools that you might find helpful in these efforts. So here's an example of one of them around what is peer support and what do peer support specialists do, specifically peer supporting recovery from mental health conditions. And there are 4, however, that you can check out and download. One introduces peer support in general, one focuses on mental health conditions, one focuses on peers supporting people with substance use disorders, and one focuses on parent peers supporting parents or other caregivers of young people with behavioral health needs. And these resources provide a starting point and a conversation with potential funders, partners, and users of peer support services. So feel free to incorporate them into presentations or print them out to use as handouts at meetings. You can certainly access them, again, as I said, in the download pod. And there's a few other ones that will really help you effectively communicate the role of peer support. But in the meantime, I want to get back to some of the conversation that we were having with Donna, Linda, and Hugh. We'll get to some of the thoughts that have really popped out from those discussions. There's a third poll that I'd like to put up, and we'll take down the briefs, and then we'll go back up to the poll. In the meantime, yep, here we go. So this last question is about what methods have you used to actually convey or share the message about the value of peers and peer support in your community. So that's an opportunity to type your answer right in. Feel free to do that, and they're going to broadcast. In the meantime, we're going to respond to some of the questions as well as you start to load in your answers. Donna, there was a question right away that asked about the distinction or the difference between a recovery coach and a peer support specialist. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind taking that question up.
So actually there's really no difference. It's really the language. In Nevada, we call our coaches peer recovery support specialists. In a different agency that I worked for, we called them peer coaches. So it really is, from what I understand, different labels. There's lots of information out there that you can read that looks at, some are called mentors, some are called coaches, some are called peer recovery support specialists, some folks are just called peers. So that's what I know about the different descriptions of peer support services.
Linda and Hugh, do you want to say anything more about the use of language and describing what we're doing and who we are, especially from a title perspective?
So from us in Connecticut, recovery support specialist is different than recovery coach. Recovery coach deals more with addiction, and recovery support specialists or peer supporters deal with mental health, which we're trying to bridge that gap so it's not so much, because it's all of us with lived experience or all of us that have some path that we have gone through that we want to support other people during their process. But language is important, and just being part of the solution and not getting so hung up on what the language or the word or the title is, and being part of the solution, but also holding the integrity of the position. It should be somebody with lived experience that fits that role, so they can support that person because they have had similar experiences. That's my opinion, but other people have different opinions.
All right. Thank you. Hugh, anything else to add about that?
I agree 100% with what Linda just said, so nothing to add.
Sounds good. All right, thank you. So, well, and I think an important point that Donna made in her remarks earlier is knowing your audience, because a lot of times we use language that resonates within our own bubble maybe, or in our own community. You know, a lot of these code words that indicate, for example, whether you're in one community or another. A lot of times the broader general public may not have any idea about what that means, and it goes right past people. So being able to speak to people with people about where and what their experience is and what's going to really reach them. I found it in cultural communities in particular, like I'm Indian, born in Kuwait, you know, the word peer, consumer, you know, none of that really makes a difference at all. So really using more neutral language and non-system language was what engaged my family when we were offered the opportunity. Hey, you know what, we've got a bunch of kids that are actually getting together who have also, you know, attempted suicide, or who have also tried to stop using drugs, who are also struggling with mental health issues. Would you want to have your son go and meet them? That attracted my father. He thought that was amazing and was immediately wanting to bring me to that community. So that's a great opportunity. There's some more questions I wanted to bring up, but before I do, let's look at some of the answers that people raised to that question. So some people said, in terms of the methods, we've got everything from advocacy groups. One person said, I found that clinicians do not understand what we're able to do that is necessary and distinct from the clinical role. So that's an interesting point. What kind of distinctions do you make between peer support and clinical services? Anybody want to take a shot at that one first? Between Donna, Linda, and Hugh? Donna, how about you? Yeah, you're on mute.
Okay, so the
There you go.
peer support is non-clinical in nature, meaning that we don't provide counseling or therapy or any kind of, we don't bring that skill to, you know, counsel an individual. So really, as a peer support specialist or recovery coach, what I bring to the table is, one, my lived experience, and two, the ability to connect an individual with the resources that they need to be successful in recovery, and also be there, you know, just to help them kind of get back into the process if there is a challenge that comes up. So they're completely distinct and different roles within helping people, but I think they also meld together, that they are can also complement and support the individual in a way that really enhances the recovery process.
All right, thank you. Anyone else, Linda?
I agree, Donna. For, you know, peer support specialists, we connect with people. It's about making connections, about meeting people, a person where they're at, and it's not necessarily about finding what's wrong. It's what happened, being present in the moment, and really just trying to be with the person and share space. So, and that's different than clinical roles, because, and we can work together. In a clinical role, it's more about fixing and figuring out for me, a peer role is more about just sharing space, holding space, and being present for that person.
Thanks, Linda. How about you? From anything around family service, family support that you've had to make distinctions around?
You know, other than the fact that we combat the issue that kids are not just little adults, that's a distinction that is something that's difficult sometimes for us adults to understand. But other than that, I mean, the values of peer support remain the same regardless of who you're providing it to. But as Linda said, it's the lived experience that provides that shared experiential background with the person you're working with that's, in my opinion, is the magic piece. That's what really makes the connection. That's what helps people feel that they can be more hopeful for the future. And so that's the piece to me that needs to be considered sacrosanct in the peer support world.
Gotcha. So this idea that we're extending the vision of what's possible in that relationship, and that's a role that we're taking, and an intentional task that we're taking on in that process. Now so part of this though is also a concern where people are being asked to do things that may or may not be within the frame of what Donna described or Linda described as, and what you just described as an important task of peer support. So, for example, in Peer Bridger project, we had to often make distinctions between us and case managers because the case management, the need was so high. There were always needs that we were picking up behind other case managers, and it was easier to just do it sometimes rather than help somebody find housing or, kind of pick up the task as opposed to kind of re-educate the system about, hey, wait a second, we need more case management support. That's not exactly what we do. We help people increase their awareness of resources and that sort of thing, maybe. But that's shifting a little bit. Because here's another example, might be assessments. People start asking for assessments. And is assessment a role? I've always felt like peer support holds the mirror up and helps people look at themselves, right? It's from a self-assessment perspective, not necessarily that I'm somehow from an expert position assessing you and your capacity or your capacity to recover or your capacity to do a particular task. Anyway, let me stop there and ask you what all three of you might think about how you define or kind of send off some of those questions about can you do this for us too, or maybe you can accompany this person to that appointment, or something that doesn't quite feel like what you had originally set up in your project.
Sure, I can try to answer that, Chaku. I'm either a really good person to ask that question or a really terrible person to ask that question because I did not come up through the human services world at all. I was in corporate America for most of my career, and 15 years ago decided to make a change. And because of the experiences that I had with my kids, I ended up doing this work. So when someone says you're doing some case management, I don't even know what that means, to be quite honest with you. What we focus on is helping families get their needs met. And if somebody else is supposed to be doing that, and we try to hold other systems accountable, we want everybody, all those systems, to meet their obligations. But if it's a matter of pointing the finger at somebody and saying that they should be doing this rather than us, and a family going without and not having those needs met, we're going to help them get the needs met.
Right, right. No, I appreciate that, and I think that's the dilemma we were in, because it wasn't necessarily about whether we didn't want to, it wasn't like that's not my job, that's yours kind of argument. It was because there's an our job here that we're all really about. But I think the idea was that there was a concern that we were going to start becoming assistant case managers, and then suddenly, what I mean, or assistant, whatever the next need was, whether it was a transporter or a case manager or some other kind of responsibility. Donna or Linda, how about you? Did you run into that in your work yet?
I have. there's a lot of people that work for agencies that it's very unclear what the peer role, what they're supposed to do in that peer role, and sometimes they shift over to being case managers not necessarily knowing. And when they start to recognize the fact that they're doing that, they try to shift back, and unfortunately the agency says no. So it's hard, as we have so many agencies that are unclear what that peer role is, excuse me, but it's holding the integrity of the position. So supporting that person where they're at, trying to get them the resources they need and their needs met whichever way possible. So sometimes as a peer support specialist, you could refer somebody to somebody else that can help them. Say they're about to lose their housing. We're not attorneys, we can't help them, but we can point them in that direction, support them during the process, stand by them so they have a shoulder to, or somebody to be with them. We're also really, we have that gift of being able to listen to somebody who talks about their healing process outside of the clinical role. So if they say that they use something like crystals where somebody doesn't necessarily believe in that, as a recovery support specialist or a person, a peer, I can listen to that and say that that's great if you're using that for healing and not necessarily use it as something against that person.
Yeah, Chaku, I'm sorry if I misunderstood your question, but let me just add on that I think that's why peer and family-run organizations are so important, because it's those peer and family-run organizations that really provide the kind of the moral compass for peer support. They're the ones who have defined what peer support is and can help us, as Linda says, maintain the integrity or the fidelity of that role and not have it turn into medication deliverers and things like that we've seen happen when those services sometimes are not provided out of that same kind of context.
Thank you. And I don't think you misunderstood. I might not have explained the question very well, and I think you're getting to it. So thank you so much. And that's going to be an ongoing challenge. Just some more questions. I want to get to some of these it's really great audience questions here. So here's another one that's really relevant to the more recently, especially disaster preparedness. So disaster preparedness specialists in behavioral health, is that a thing? And in your experience, I know I have some thoughts about that I'd like to offer. And it says here it's important to include peer supports in our response efforts for mental health and substance use, especially after disasters. And with the hurricanes we just had, Maria and Harvey in particular, that's become an issue in Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands and in Texas. Any thoughts about it? Well, I'll just give a quick update while you're thinking about it, and I'll just say that the Disaster Technical Assistance Center at SAMHSA, to their credit, is now looking at a more formal response. Since, I don't know if you remember, but after 9/11, there was a project called Project Liberty in New York State, and one of the things we did in that process was hire 60 peer specialists as part of the what was called the Crisis Counseling Program of the Disaster Technical Assistance Project, and got the funding to actually implement an immediate phone-based, in-person engagement, all kinds of support for people who were experiencing together the trauma after 9/11. And it was a real eye-opener for everyone to realize just how much more peer support was needed in that kind of a situation. And so the same thing came true in New York around Hurricane Sandy, and then in Louisiana around Hurricane Katrina. And so post-Hurricane Maria and Harvey, the opportunity to have peer support be available became an explicit conversation. And to everyone's credit, there's even more happening in that process. For example, National Empowerment Center, I'm seeing a comment here, Maria Ostheimer from National Empowerment Center is talking about being in Puerto Rico with ECPR. And they were already there, and they continue to provide that kind of support. And there's a peer specialist implementation project going on in Puerto Rico right now. And the same thing is true with U.S. Virgin Islands. And of course, the resources in Texas. All right, so let's move to another set of questions here. Another one is, how can I market my skills as a forensic peer support specialist to a market that has not been open to the idea? So Linda, you started out that initial talk around getting people interested in an idea. Can you say a little bit more about that, and then we'll get Donna and Hugh to offer a thought again as well. In this case, it's forensic peer support specialist, but it might be applicable in any context.
Well, for anything that you want to talk about the value of, you could look at other agencies or other states that have forensic peer support specialists and collect the data, going with Hugh, collect the data on how it has been effective. In Connecticut, we have had a little bit of the ability, a little bit of opening into DOC to try to provide some peer support specialists, but I know other states are doing a phenomenal job of connecting somebody with a person that's currently incarcerated before they even leave, and then helping them back out into the community. So if you're trying to market in an area that they're not using forensic peer support specialists, look in an area that they're using or having people work in that role and doing a very good job, and they're bringing the recidivism numbers down, again going with some data, and really being persistent and not letting it get to you, and making sure you have that valuable person that you can talk to when you are you do approach somebody that it doesn't necessarily agree with the peer position or doesn't agree with the forensic peer position, and also might give you the no over and over again. Just be persistent and don't give up, because it's a valuable thing.
I definitely agree with.
Yeah, Donna.
I was just going to say I definitely agree with what Linda just said. I'm a firm believer in not reinventing the wheel and seeing what else is out there. There's lots of resources for all of us to use. Finding out what has worked for other folks will definitely help us as we try to, get our message around the value of the peer support. I know one of the things that I have experienced is, especially in the substance use world, is that many of us may have criminal backgrounds, and so when you're working in that field, there may be some restrictions around that. So knowing what you're up against before you actually put together your message is important.
Excellent. Well, for those of you who are interested in forensic peer support, and Virginia Carnes, in your comment, thank you. There are past programs like the Howie the Harp Center in New York City was one of the first to really start working in forensic peer support, and in some ways put it on the map. From there, ever since, there's been a toolkit that was created by the American College for Mental Health Administration, ACMA Peer Services Toolkit, and there's a variety of others. We'll be able to, through Brass Tacks, if you both go to the Brass Tacks website or request technical assistance in this area, there's a great deal of assistance there. All right, so let's keep going. These are great discussions. I'm going to go to the next question here about this topic, which I'm hoping that some of the questions that we have here are really getting into some complex issues about communicating the values. So let me give you an example. One person said, I can't get anything published even about peer support unless I put in impact around medication. And that was an interesting point, because a lot of times, as many of you might find with managed care, for example, if you're in states that involve managed care, the HEDIS measures, which are measures that have to do with getting someone to take their medications and or the outcome of getting to their doctor or appointments. These kinds of measures are measures that are important to the health system, so they're system outcomes. Is there a role in peer support in having conversations with people? Is there some continuum, essentially, around where it becomes a no-no for you, or where it becomes something that you are open to actually having a conversation around and say, yeah, you know what, you can actually help people evaluate their options? I guess I'm just asking, where is it for you? Where do you draw the line on some of those kinds of issues around what peer support is and isn't? Linda?
Well, I think I think that kind of goes along with what you just said about holding the mirror. So when you're supporting somebody, you hold the mirror for their own self-assessment. So if I'm supporting somebody and they're asking me for something, and even though I think it might be outside of the realm of possibility, then they're asking me for some support. Obviously, you're not going to go down some areas where you cross some ethical lines or some legal lines, but to support the person where they're at, to walk along them through their path or whatever they're going through, And when it comes to agencies and applying their rules, I'm thankful I work for an agency where it is about peer support. We do support one another, and I can go into the role and be my authentic self and not have to go with an agency saying you have to talk to that person about their medication. I feel like that's a personal choice. Anybody deciding to take medication or not take medication is a personal choice, and maybe referring that person to get some information on their own in some areas so they can get some information on their own. But that's a very personal choice, and I feel like when agencies ask somebody to force somebody to take medication or talk them into it, not force, but talk them into taking medication, that might be something that we want to stay away from. But again, that's kind of my opinion.
Well, it's helpful. I mean, I think that's kind of the idea here. In communicating the role of peer support in these situations has gotten more complicated in a Medicaid managed care or Medicaid redesigned environment where people are looking for that cost savings around reducing rehospitalizations, reducing cost of systems, especially for those of us with co-occurring mental health, addiction, physical health issues. It's certainly become a major topic. So if we can say we have an impact in the area, but at the same time retain some integrity, that's something we ought to be considering. All right, so here's another question along those lines. If you have, let's say you have a lot of data, Hugh, how do you choose which data you're going with?
So for us, it depends on the audience, right? So, if we're going to be talking to people who are in the child welfare system, we're going to be talking about our data related to keeping families intact and reuniting families. So, so it's really knowing your audience, as one of my colleagues mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm. Donna or Linda, do you have any additional thoughts about that?
No, I agree with what he said, just being able to know your audience and also being able to present the data that's pertinent to that audience that you're talking to. So, for instance, if I'm talking to an MCO, I might want to talk about the cost savings because that's the bottom line. A lot of times in looking, at the cost savings, whereas if I'm talking to somebody, to another audience that may be more interested in, helping people find employment or safe housing or something like that, the data might look a little different.
Right. Thank you. Linda?
And thank you, Hugh, for being the data person because it's not my favorite subject, but I also want to be very mindful of where your sources are, where you're collecting the data from when you're sharing it with others. So just be very mindful of where you're collecting it from.
Right. Interesting. Well, one of the things that tends to come up here, and in this conversation, I'm noticing it in a lot of the questions that people are asking are, there's a lot of infrastructure to build within an organization, including these kinds of questions around how do I even choose what data, how do we start to identify what measures. I was impressed that you came up with some markers that were important to express. That had a process associated with it, I'm sure. If you're looking for technical assistance around those infrastructure items, or whether it's curriculum, or whether it's the job descriptions, or whether it's the HR functions, I'd like to encourage you to go to the Brass Tacks website and ask for that kind of technical assistance. There's also the National Technical Assistance Centers like the STAR Center and others. There's PeerLink that exists. There's National Empowerment Center, and there's the Family Cafe TA Center, and there's Doors to Wellbeing TA Center. All of us are really charged with the task of supporting peer and family-run organizations to develop that infrastructure. While the focus of this conversation is really this main component of conveying the role and really all the different ways in which that needs to be done. And data, that kind of stuff is one part of it. Let's go back to the knowing your audience point, though. So what method do you use, and maybe this is to all of you, to get to know your audience, to research the audience that you're hoping to speak to? What's the actual concrete thing or a set of things that you do to make that happen?
So I would always try to, if I can, understand who the participants are before I get to the meeting, maybe a list of individuals that may be there that I'm presenting to. Overall, what's the objective of the meeting that I'm going to, and why do they want me to present, or why do I feel it's important to present? And then, don't be afraid to ask questions either. So that always helps to understand who the audience is. Maybe, I have presented where I've talked to folks before I even started my presentation to find out where they were, what their background was, what their needs were, what they were looking for from the presentation, to make sure that I was in line with the message that I was giving. I hope that makes sense, but
it does.
It's just a little bit of work on your part.
Yeah, but you're saying, though, is even if you didn't get there ahead of time with some of that background information, like a registration list or some data from the person setting it up, you're saying even when you're there at the beginning, you could really be asking people, hey, what brought you here? What's important to you? What are your intentions? What are you interested in, right? So that you can frame, and somewhat often you have to be willing to move with that or adapt to that, I think, in that regard. Linda or Hugh, do you have any additional thoughts about that?
I agree with Donna said, just asking the questions and asking your audience and getting the feel for the questions you're being asked. If you're going to an agency, you can kind of look at the policies that they have in place. If you're going to a town, you could look at some of the policies that they have in place. It depends on where you're going, if you have that time. But a lot of times you can just get the feel for your audience by the questions they're either asking you, the agenda they have in place, or start asking the question of what brought you here and what information are you looking for from me.
Right. Excellent.
I agree with both what Donna and Linda said. Sometimes with smaller groups, I give them the freedom to take the discussion in a whole different direction. If what we're talking about is not what they are interested in, then there's not a whole lot of usefulness in continuing that discussion. So let's talk about the things that you're interested in.
Right. Yeah, you're going to walk the talk, huh? Here we're going to engage people with what we're doing. That's fantastic. Well, another question that has been important is really taking the time to use story. And Linda, you mentioned that. Donna, you mentioned that. Hugh, you mentioned that. I guess how do you help people in your organizations learn how to use story in conveying peer support? What are some techniques or strategies or approaches you use to build that capacity within your organization?
Well, I can speak for what we do. I mean, we train our staff, which we call parent peer specialists, on how to tell their own story in a way that is compelling, and we teach all families that we work with how they can tell their story in a way that's more likely to have someone, if they have needs that need to be met, that makes it more likely for those needs to be met. One of the challenges in that is that there's a fair amount of frustration that's been built up over perhaps several years. And so when families first tell their stories, it's associated with a fair amount of venom or anger. And they also, another challenge that they do is they tend to tell a chronological story. And that's not always the best way to do it. You have to really know what it is that you're wanting to convey, and then trim it down so that you can convey that in the best manner. So teaching people how to do that, that's a skill. Some people have it naturally, but I absolutely believe that we can teach people how to do that. And so we do that as part of our training for our parent peer specialists, which they in turn pass on to the families that they work with.
All right, thank you. Donna or Linda?
I definitely agree with what you said, having that skills training. I know, when I first got involved in this work, we would talk about our past, and so being able to stay focused on the recovery piece and being full of hope instead of the baggage that came along with that addiction is really important. So, you know, making sure that the story is always focused on recovery and the positive aspects of that is really important. And it's really through skills training.
Excellent. Linda?
If we're training somebody as a peer support specialist to share their story as part of their role, then there's some guidelines and try to have that person, there is a knack to sharing your story, and try to focus on the positive or try to connect with that person. So not to share your story, just simply to share your story, but to connect with the other individual you're trying to support. If somebody's sharing their story as part of a presentation, then training doesn't necessarily need to go to that. Somebody usually learns. For myself, I've learned how to share my story where I bring parts of it that are important, but I gear towards the positive parts because my life is about the recovery and not necessarily about that. But I also want to highlight what I've been through so people recognize that I've been through that also. But I think it's just, if it's for a peer support specialist, there is a knack to teaching to try to get out the important parts or try to support that person so they share a way to connect with that other individual they're supporting.
Right. So if, for example, if I'm trying to extend a message of hope, there are stories that I can start to use that might convey that, right? Stories of overcoming challenges or barriers of some kind. If I'm trying to convey an example of some kind of system issue, there might be stories that reflect some of the challenges that came up in working with a system or, you know, having to deal with particular aspects. Is that kind of what you mean? Really matching the message in the story with the outcome of the message. Okay, that's really cool. And that is complicated. I mean, it's helpful to hear that. Are there specific trainings that you've created for this? Or are you using trainings that have already been created, or are these ones that are they just more of the internal supervision and training that is happening in the organization?
Ours is internally developed.
Okay.
Ours is internally developed also.
Okay. Same for you, Donna? Interesting. Okay, thanks. All right. So now this is a little bit of a. Actually, I know we're running short on time here. I have a million more questions, guys. I think the community does. This conversation shouldn't end, and everyone's done a great job both in asking questions, placing information out that we needed, and of course, from each of you, Donna, Linda, and Hugh, in presenting for us. What we want you to know is that, and remind you, that there are these resources available for download just to get started. There's some great work put into all of these resources, so I hope you do check them out and utilize them. I'm really pleased that the kind of information we're putting out there is getting some traction. I'm noticing that people are really conveying peer support and the value of peer support in the ways that Donna, Hugh, and Linda, you talked about. If you want to follow up with you, Linda or Donna, here's their contact information on the website. One thing we want you to know is that after this webinar or Recovery Live session closes, there'll be a survey that comes up. Please take a few minutes and just answer that survey. It won't take you long at all. Let us know how this program was of value to you, and hopefully we'll be able to do some more in that regard. There'll be some upcoming Recovery Live events for you to participate in, and lots more great work to get us all involved in. I'm going to end with just thanking you, Donna, Linda, and Hugh,